Time now for our news review segment where we take a look at one of our stories in more detail. The BBC's Director General says he will not resign after a backlash to the removal of Gary Lineker, the popular host of the broadcaster's Cornerstone soccer programme. Tim Davie says the situation should be resolved calmly. Lineker was suspended after accusing the UK government of using Nazi-era rhetoric in its new immigration policy. His ouster set off a staff boycott which forced the BBC to curtail major portions of its weekend sports coverage. Many politicians and public figures slammed the BBC's move, accusing the state-funded broadcaster of buckling to demands from the ruling Conservatives. Joining us for more on that is Robert Carter, our correspondent in the British capital, London. And also we have Fra Hughes, who is a journalist and author and activist from Belfast. Gentlemen, welcome. Robert, if I could start with you. What's the latest that you're hearing there? Lineker, as I understand, he's not a news anchor, he's a sports presenter. As I understand it, he has more freedom to express political views. So why the heavy government backlash?
Well, quite frankly, I actually am of the opinion that Gary Lineker has routinely gone outside of his lane in his political opinions that he's expressed on a football show, Match of the Day as it's known here. Basically, Gary Lineker has no business getting involved in politics as far as I'm concerned. He's paid by the BBC huge sums of money to basically talk about a ball being kicked up and down a pitch. However, we found that on occasions which suited the BBC, he was given total freedom to espouse any kind of political rhetoric and propaganda that he saw fit. And of course, Gary Lineker identifies and comes from a very liberal, sort of left-wing position. You could even describe him as being a bit woke, this kind of trend coming out of the West, where he has a kind of God-given right to virtue signal and lecture others, particularly from the Muslim and Arab world, about human rights abuses and how they should be treating people better, and how footballing competitions should never have been allowed to be hosted in Muslim countries, that type of thing, which we saw throughout the World Cup and his coverage there. The BBC had no issue with Gary Lineker being as political as he possibly could during that whole competition. However, Gary Lineker was under the false assumption that because the BBC was okay with him espousing anti-Arab, anti-Muslim political rhetoric, that when he came back to the UK, he thought he had a green light to talk about all political issues. But no, that's clearly not the case. He spoke out against the British establishment, and in particular, he basically did the one thing that you're not allowed to do in Western mainstream media circles, which is talk about or conflate the suffering which the Jewish people have dealt with during Nazi Germany era, and any other type of suffering whatsoever, because pro-Israel factions and lobby groups basically do not want a conflation of the Holocaust and Jewish suffering with any other type of suffering, because it damages their position in basically using anti-Semitism as a weapon to be critics of Israel and pro-Palestine figures. Something which, to his credit, Gary Lineker has done. He has spoken up in favor of the Palestinians on Twitter on a few occasions in the past.
Right.
And that, again, seems as if it's presented a window of opportunity for his critics to try and get him kicked off of television.
So, Farah, what's your take on that? Just a few months ago, as Robert noted, the UK state broadcaster, the BBC, welcomed or didn't say anything, nor did the government, when Lineker expressed views over alleged human rights accusations at the Qatar World Cup. Yet when it comes, but it has objected to statements over human rights issues within the UK and from possible violations with the UK government.
Yes, well, in context with the question itself, I think what we're looking at here is political censorship. You need to separate out whether or not Gary Lineker has the right as an individual in society to the freedom of speech, the right to use social media in order to put out his own political opinion or his own kind of moral objections to what the government of the day is doing. It's very true that other presenters, such as Neil Andrews and Alan Sugar, have made political derogatory remarks before on their social media without any sanction whatsoever. So this appears to be specifically targeted against Gary Lineker because he's speaking out against governmental public policy, which comes down to the civil rights of the individual to speak out against the government and power of the day. And I was just doing a tiny wee bit of research there earlier, and apparently there is a statue outside BBC headquarters in London. It's a statue to commemorate George Orwell, who wrote 1984, which is very symbolic, but that happens to be outside. He was a presenter for the BBC, and there's a plaque on the wall beside the BBC statue that celebrates George Orwell, and it says, "If liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear." So I suppose the question for the BBC is, does Gary Lineker have the right to tell people in power what they do not want to hear?
So, Robert, Fra touched on social media. I'm seeing here that Lineker has something like 9 million followers on just one social media platform, Twitter. So he has a large fan base within the UK, and he's a popular figure. Is that why the government is trying to silence him?
Yeah, no doubt. Gary Lineker is incredibly popular. He was an international footballer himself back in the day, so he's very, very well known. And yeah, he's pushing views which are contrary to the British establishment, and obviously they're going to have issue with that. But what we have to take from this story, because quite frankly, I don't really care what happens to Gary Lineker. He's a millionaire. He's going to be fine. Yeah, sure, he's going to cry the blues that his freedom of speech is under attack. But ultimately, Gary Lineker doesn't stand. He's not a champion of freedom of speech. He never has been. In fact, he routinely blocks people on Twitter who call him out for his total hypocrisy on political issues like pushing issues on Qatar, when in fact the biggest human rights abusers who shouldn't be hosting any international competition, if you're going to use that standard, would be America, for example, or Great Britain. So the fact of the matter is, Gary Lineker, I think he made his bed and he's going to lie in it. But what we have to learn from this is that the BBC's claim that it is an impartial player on the world news stage is total and utter rubbish. It is a state-backed mouthpiece for the British establishment, always has been, always will be. And the fact of the matter is that they censor other state media, like, for example, RT, because, oh, it's backed by the Russian government, it's pushing a Russian worldview, we can't have that. But the BBC does exactly the same thing in reverse, yet they're given total freedom to do so. The only difference between channels like RT, Press TV, is we don't deny who we are. We don't deny what our editorial line is. We own up to it and we confess. Yes, we have a political worldview, and we are defending, the rights of oppressed people and so on and so forth, the Palestinians and elsewhere. The BBC, on the other hand, shamelessly claim that they're impartial on all issues when they're blatantly not. And this story, luckily, has exposed them as such, and I hope that more people in the Western world will realize the truth for what it is. The BBC cannot be trusted, and Gary Lineker deserves it. He was a propaganda rent boy for the BBC and has pushed political views routinely whenever the BBC has given the green light to do so. I dare say they've even written the scripts which he spoke during the World Cup, pushing all of these political issues which were derogatory against the Arabs, against the Muslims, and he's done it on other occasions in the past. But now that he's talking out against the British establishment, he's being silenced. Well, serves you right, Gary Lineker. What do you expect? You work for the BBC.
Indeed. Now, when I read the story, and it's a fluid story. We don't know if the bill's going to pass or not. But one of the ironies of this whole, just putting Lineker aside for us a moment, final question, the irony here is that the parents of both the UK Prime Minister and the Home Secretary, who are spearheading the bill, immigrated to the UK themselves in the 1960s when their parents, I believe Kenya and Mauritius were under British colonial rule.
Yes, and you don't have to go that much farther from the present cabinet. I believe Boris Johnson's father was an immigrant as well. I personally have no problem with immigration. I believe it leads to greater diversity within society, and also, leads to more tolerance and more love and respect among the different ethnic, religious, and political views within the country. I have to say that the BBC is funded by the British public through the television licence fee. So we, the members of the British public and for the public who are paying for the licence fee, are actually paying for the opportunity to be brainwashed by our own corporation, by our own mainstream media, government-led, government-censored, government-sponsored, government-funded television broadcasting company. I no longer watch MSN in the United Kingdom or Ireland. I no longer watch the television, listen to the news, or read the papers, because it's just blatant propaganda. And, the sooner that we all stop paying the license fee, the better.
Okay, I'm afraid we have run out of time. Thank you very much indeed. Let me thank our guest, Robert Carter, as our correspondent in London. Robert, thank you. Fra Hughes is a journalist, author, and activist. Fra, thank you as well. From Belfast. That brings an end to another edition of the News Review.